to Sew with Stacy. Today we're going to make some pillows. Now this project is a really great simple project that you can do in about an hour or two. It's all straight line stitching and it doesn't even have a zipper. The construction of our pillow includes a pocket in the back that makes it much easier to sew, but also for you to be able to put your pillow insert when you are done. Now, if you do want an additional challenge, we are going to show you how to put together piping that you can actually insert onto the side of your pillow just to give it a little bit of an extra finish. But don't worry, you don't have to include the piping if you don't feel confident or if you think it's just a little bit too complicated for you to do at this point in your sewing career. But don't worry, at some point it will be very easy for you to do as well. Are you ready? Let's get sewing. To complete your pillow, there are a few supplies that you will need. First, you'll need your fabric. I've chosen one type of fabric for the front of my pillow and one type of fabric for the back. You can decide what fabric you have. You can have the same for both or do two different backs like I have. You'll need 1/2 meter of each fabric that you've chosen. Next, you'll want coordinating thread. I've chosen thread that matches the back of my fabric because we're going to be doing some top stitching on that back piece and I didn't want to see those stitch lines. If you wish to put piping on the side of your bag, you will also need to choose some cord. I've chosen a 5mm cord because this works really nicely with an 18-inch pillow. You'll need about 2 meters of cord for this project. And finally, you'll need an 18-inch pillow insert if you don't already have one. Along with the supplies, you'll need a few tools from your sewing toolkit to complete your pillow. First, you'll need your ruler, scissors, and your fabric pencil or chalk to be able to measure, mark, and cut to the pieces that we will need for the pattern. If you happen to have a rotary cutter, feel free to use this. Don't worry if you don't. The tutorial shows how you measure, cut your fabric using these tools. We will be doing a lot of pinning on this project, so you definitely want to grab your pins. And if you decide to put the piping on the side of your pillow, I highly suggest that you use a zipper foot. If you don't have a zipper foot for your machine, don't worry, you can use a standard foot. It can be a bit tricky, but you can still use a normal foot. But if you happen to have a zipper foot, most sewing machines have these as part of their basic setup. I highly suggest using a zipper foot. And finally, as always, I grab my seam ripper because we always make mistakes. To make your pillow, you will need to cut one 19-inch by 19-inch piece of fabric from the fabric you've chosen for the front of your pillow. You will then need to cut two 19-inch by 13-inch pieces of fabric from the fabric you've chosen for the back of your pillow. If you plan on putting the piping on the side of your pillow, you will also need to cut one 1 3/4 inch fabric strip from whichever fabric you're using for that piping, and that strip will need to be 82 inches long. Don't worry if you don't have enough fabric to cut 82 inches. You can cut a couple pieces and we'll demonstrate to you on how you can connect those pieces of fabric to make one longer fabric strip. Also, for the piping, you will need to have a 2-meter piece of your piping cord. fabric for the piping, you need to have a 1 3/4 inch wide fabric strip that's 82 inches long. Now, I don't have enough fabric here to cut one long strip, so I'm going to go ahead and cut two, and I'll show you how you can take two strips and bind them together to make one long one. So now I'm going to measure two 1 3/4 inch fabric strips from the fabric for our piping. If you wish to put piping on, you're going to need to do that first. When I cut my fabric, I didn't have enough fabric to create one long fabric strip that's needed for this pillow. So I ended up cutting two fabric strips that were slightly shorter than what's necessary. But I can show you how you can actually put these together to create one longer strip. What we'll want to do is we'll want to find the ends of each of the strips and cross them over so that they're perpendicular. That means that they are 90-degree angles from one another. You don't want them parallel, you won't get a nice finish. You want to have perpendicular fabric strips. Next, we're going to draw a line from one corner to the other corner in the diagonal. And then we're going to make a stitch across that line. When we do that, once that's stitched, we can then fold this back over, and you can now see that you have one long continuous piece of fabric. By having this on the diagonal, it makes it less visible on your pillow. So let's go ahead and sew that straight line. So now if I fold that over, you can see I have a continuous strip of fabric. I'm going to trim off, whoopsie daisy. I'm going to trim off that little piece of fabric to about 1/4 inch from the seam. I'm going to trim off these little threads as well. And there I have it. And before I can start making my piping, I need to measure out 82 inches of my fabric strip. So I'm going to grab my ruler and I'm going to go ahead and measure. It's 24. It's 48. 72. And cut this at the 10, I will have 82. Now that we have the correct length of our fabric strip, we need to put together our piping. We'll need the fabric strip, and we'll need to bring our cord. We're going to sew the cord inside the fabric strip. But we're going to do this in a special way. We're going to actually use our zipper foot to be able to construct our piping. And the reason why we're going to use our zipper foot is because as you're sewing, you're going to align your fabric to the one edge of your zipper foot, and that will put the needle a lot closer to the cord while we're sewing, and that's what we want. We want a nice tight construction so that the cord is nicely inserted into the fabric strip. So you'll need to grab your zipper foot from your machine and replace that with your normal strun. So we're all ready to sew. We're going to put it facing down, and we're going to grab our cord and we're going to put it in the middle and fold that fabric strip over, encasing that cord inside the fabric. Then we'll use our sewing machine to sew a line close to that cord. You don't want it exactly on top of the cord. You want to give a little bit of wiggle room, but you still want a nice tight connection. You also want to start maybe 4 inches in, because what we'll need to do is when this gets put onto the pillowcase, this will need to be loosened so we can overlap them and put them back together. So you want to leave about 4 inches from the edge that's unsewn. So we're going to start our sewing stitch from here, and we're going to keep sewing along the cord until the fabric is all encased. We're going to sew nice and slowly, as we will want to make sure that we have the fabric aligned properly. When you get to the end of sewing your piping together, you need to leave another 3 to 4 inches so that when we do put this around the pillow, you'll be able to overlap this and sew them together. So you'll have about 3 or 4 inches on the front and 3 or 4 inches on the end. Our next step is to pin the piping onto the front piece of fabric for our pillow. You'll want to make sure you understand what side is the top and the bottom of your pillow. If you have a design such as this one, if it doesn't have a design, the bottom doesn't necessarily matter and the top doesn't necessarily matter. You'll want to grab one end of your piping, and you'll want to find the edge and line that up with the middle bottom edge of your pillow top fabric. You'll then want to make sure that those two edges line up and that the actual space where the piping is on the inside of the fabric. It might feel a little not intuitive, but what will happen is when we pull this right side out after we finish sewing, this piping will appear on the right side of the pillow. So you kind of want everything on the inside of your fabric. And we'll go ahead and start pinning that. I tend to use a lot of pins when I'm doing this because I want to keep this piping as close as possible and as straight as possible to the bottom edge of this piece of fabric. Once you get to the corner, you don't want to pin exactly at the corner because we need to turn this so it goes up the longer edge here. You'll want to kind of put it in so you have about a 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch from that edge. To turn the corner, kind of want to do that, but it doesn't cause a really nice corner. The best way to do it is to actually give it a little bit of a trim. So the technique I tend to use is you can take your piping and you fold it towards you so that there's the edge of your fabric and the edge of your binding align. And you get a nice little corner part. I'll turn this a little bit so you can see. A little corner part there. And I'm going to take my scissors and actually trim that, just a nice little cut. So it will give me a little bit of wiggle room to be able to turn my piping and line it up on this edge. So if I grab my scissors, I'm going to turn it again so I can use my right hand. So I'm going to line it up there. And I'm just going to do a nice trim all the way up to where that line of stitching is. You don't want to cut the line of stitching because that will ruin the actual piping casing, but just all the way up to that stitching. And so now if we turn our piping downward, you will see that it does a nice corner on that edge right there. And what will happen is when we sew this on, we'll sew around that, and that will make, when we turn this inside out, that corner nice and solid. We'll continue pinning this edge of the piping down along this end now. And again, as you get to this corner, we're going to use the same technique that we just did on the other corner. So we're going to pin it so we're maybe 1/2 inch to 1/4 of an inch away. We're going to turn our piping away from us, holding it down and creating that nice little angled corner. Grabbing our scissors and just cutting that corner up to the line of stitching. And then we'll bring it straight down, curve it around. And pin. We'll keep doing this all the way until we get to the bottom edge of the piping. We've now reached the bottom of our piping, and we need to find a way to put these together without it being too visible as an end result. So the technique I use is I line them up together because we're going to need to trim one of these. I'm going to trim this bottom layer first, and I'm going to cut through the fabric all the way through. And we'll put that to the side. Now, in order to connect these, I want to have the cords end at the same place. So what I do is I take the bottom part of that piping container, put one part underneath the one I just trimmed, and I'm going to cut the cord from this side to match so that they're aligned. Just the cord, not the fabric. Now with this extra fabric, I'm going to trim this just a smidge. Don't need all that extra fabric. But I'm going to fold that over in half and create a nice little pocket edge and encase the one coming in inside that edge. So then what you see now is you just see a little lined edge that's nice and finished. It's folded over, you're not going to get any stray thread through there or anything like that. And if I turn this over as well, you'll see that on the other side it also is nice clean edge. And we're just going to pin that together. We've now connected our two pieces of piping together. And now that we've pinned it all on, we now just need to sew this piping onto our fabric. Here are a few helpful tips as we sew the piping onto your front of your pillow. First, you'll want to grab the container you store your pins on and put it next to you so you can take your pins out as you sew. Secondly, you'll want to start your sewing in the middle of one of the edges of your pillow fabric. Thirdly, you'll want to keep sewing with your zipper foot so you can get a close finish to the cord that's in your piping. And finally, as you're sewing, you just want to follow along the same line or be a bit closer to the cord so that the stitches won't appear on your final result. As you get closer to the corner, you'll just want to use your finger and pull out that cord so that you can see those stitch lines. Sometimes it's a bit hard to see the stitch lines, but if you use your finger to pull it out, you'll be able to see them and you can continue your sewing. Be careful of your finger to not get it underneath the needle, but if you take your time and go quite slow, you can do it very nicely. For the back of our pillow, we want to create this really nice clean edge on the panels that will construct the back. To do this, you will need to take the two panels that we've pre-cut and on one of the really long edges, fold over 1/4 of an inch once and then twice. And this will create a nice 1/4 of an inch hem along that long edge. And that's what we want for our back panels. So if we do that on both of the panels, and then we do a nice top stitch along that edge to finish it off. When we do sew that top stitch for the panel, we want to change out our foot from the zipper foot to our normal foot. It will just make it a little bit easier to sew the top stitching. And then we just stitch across the top of that panel. And as you can see, the top stitching is as close to the edge as possible. We'll do that on the second panel as well. Now that you've finished the top stitching on each of your two back panels, we need to attach those panels onto the front of your fabric. So grab one of those panels and lay it flat on top of your front fabric that's facing up on your table. What you want to do is you want to put the first panel aligning to the top of your pillow. If you've got a pattern like this, you need to identify what the top of the pillow is, because we don't want our dinosaurs looking downward on our pillow, we want it on the top. So we want to lay the first panel so it's aligned with the top of our pillow. We also want to make sure that the really nice edge that we want to have facing outward is facing down on top of the pillow. We'll align that nicely with the edges of our front of our pillow, and we'll pin that in place. If you've put the piping on the front of your pillow, just be very aware of when you're pinning so that you don't hurt yourself as you're pinning it along the piping. I tend to do a lot of pinning while I'm doing this, just so that it doesn't move when I sew it. Especially if you've put piping on it, you want to have a lot of extra pins. Now that the top panel is on, we'll need to put the bottom panel. And to do that, you take the second panel and you line the cut edge with the bottom edge of your front fabric. And what you'll see is that there's an overlap of the two panels in the middle. And this creates that pocket for you to be able to put that pillow insert inside. So once you're happy with that, you can start pinning it in place. Another little tip I do is I usually start pinning from the corners, again just to make sure that those corners are nice and aligned, and then go up the edge. Now that everything's pinned in place, we just need to sew the front and the back pieces together. If you haven't put any piping in, go ahead and sew these pieces all around using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. If you've put piping in, when you sew this together, you'll want to sew it from the front side. And the reason for that is you can see the stitch line that we've put in when we attach the piping to the front piece of our fabric. And when you do sew this, not only do you want to switch out your presser foot again to your zipper foot, but you want to follow that line, but a little bit closer to the inside cord of the pillow to make it nice and tight in there, but not on the cord. So there's still a little bit of wiggle room. You can feel it with your finger, that you can get a little bit closer to that cord to make it a nice tight finish. But try to avoid being on the closer side of the edge of the pillow, as your stitch lines will appear when you do turn the pillow right side out. I'm going to go ahead and sew this, and since I have cord, I'm going to change out my presser foot. And I'm going to stitch just a little bit on the inside of that line that's already there for me. It gives me a little bit of a nice guide. When you do get to these corners, you might want to lift your fabric up and just have a peek under and make sure the corner is pressed as far in as possible to avoid any stitches on top of the cord. Now that you finished sewing the front and back of your pillow together, we need to turn out your pillowcase. But before we do that, I suggest that you trim your corners, cut off the corner just up to the seam line so that your corners will be nice and sharp. You might also want to trim away any extra threads, loose threads, or anything else that you might want off the pillowcase to make it look really nice. To turn it inside out, just put your hand inside your pocket that you've created, put your finger in the corner, pinch, and then just pull it through. And then kind of work your corner to make it look nice and sharp. And continue that process for all 4 corners. And then the final thing to do is to put your pillow insert inside your beautiful new pillowcase. Great job, you've now finished your pillow project. Thank you for joining us today at Sew with Stacy. We hope you really enjoyed this video. Please do click on the like below, as well as subscribe to our channel for more wonderful DIY sewing projects coming your way very, very soon. Hit that alarm bell so you can get notified of these great projects coming. Thank you, and we'll see you really soon.